will now have a look at the costs of offshore renewables and the question if recent cost increases are maybe good news. And to discuss this, I'd like to ask Alexander VANDENBERGHE, Rasmus, Nicolas with RINGGAARD, Joyce von MARSCHALL, Pierre WARLOP, and Bertrand JACQUET to join me on stage, please. Bonjour, good morning, hello. Yeah, just sit where you'd like. Have you all grabbed a microphone? No, but there are microphones over there. Hello.
Hey, good to
Hi.
see you.
Good to see you. Huh?
Lost one.
Did we? Oh yeah, there he is. Bonjour, ça va? Thank you for being here. I hope this works with my microphone. I'm so sorry, it's we have certain technical problems here. Alexander, there you are. Thank you for being back with us. Could you set the scene to start with of how the cost curves have moved up and down over the past few years?
Yes, very good, and thank you for having me back on stage so quickly. So I think one thing to realize here is that when we look at wind energy, we have to differentiate between the different technologies. Yeah. For onshore wind, we see that the cost reduction trend continues quite steadily, slowly but surely. It goes slightly so ever down and down. Right now, we have about, for every megawatt of onshore wind capacity, the investment cost is 1.4 million euros on a project, every project level at European level, right? For offshore wind, the story is slightly different. And if you look at the cost, it goes a little bit up and down, and it's very dependent on the market. Mm-hmm. In which country do the project reach FID? What is the development cost behind that project? Big cost driver is, do they have to pay for the grid connection? Not sure. Some countries you do, some countries you don't. That's a big development cost. Second is the size of the projects, the maturity of the market. And what we see is that there is a more rigid curve for the costs. If we looked at last year, we see that the project that reached FID reached it at around 3 million euro per megawatt finance cost. What that doesn't say is what were the projects that did not reach FID and what was their cost structures, of course. And we do know that the cost of capital is increasing. And that hits the offshore wind projects specifically much harder than the onshore wind projects. And so we do see that a lot of projects are not reaching FID just yet, and they're delaying that. We didn't see any FID for floating wind, for instance, and there the cost structure is, of course, much higher because it's really project specific. But that gives you a little bit of a tone, part of the discussions. Then when we're talking about offshore wind cost, it's very hard to pinpoint it as offshore wind in Europe, but it really depends on the markets that we're talking about.
Mm. So we're talking about costs, but your organization says we shouldn't only focus on costs. You're putting this new offshore wind deal for Europe on the table. Tell us more about that.
Yes. So because of what I mentioned also in the earlier stage, now we are at this crossroads in the offshore wind sector with very high ambitions, but it's getting riskier and harder to get the projects over the line. A few months ago at our annual event in Copenhagen, together with more than 100 companies and organizations, we launched this call for a new offshore wind deal for Europe. And in that, we are asking for the governments in Europe to basically make very robust plans for 100 gigawatt to be auctioned off across a 10-year period. Give that 10-year visibility is extremely important. and to do it with the right auction design framework. Two elements of particular interest and in particular importance is do it with two-sided CFDs, contracts for difference. Contracts for difference are, for the government in the long term, a zero-sum operation, but they offer revenue stabilization. You can predict the project's revenues over the 25, 30, 35-year lifetime of the project, which for the investors is great news. Hence, you can raise capital at a lower interest rate. The second important element is indexation. Make sure that the award price can be indexed between the time of the award of the auction, your strike price that you bid. Between that and when you reach FID, there are a number of years that often pass. There may be different realities, as we have seen, for instance, with the COVID pandemic, supply chain disruptions. We see it now, of course, with the Trump administration and with the tariffs, uncertainties on material prices. These all come with additional costs that needs to be taken care of. That's why this indexation is so important. Likewise, of course, the CFD auction needs to make sure that the strike price is indexed across the lifetime of the project to make sure that, of course, we are not covering for inflation. Yeah, so that we need to do. If we can do that, 100 gigawatts spread over 10 years with two-sided CFDs and with indexation, then the industry promises that they will be able to raise the capital. As Remy Gruet mentioned on the panel before, the investments that we need are private investments. We need to get them from the banks. We need to get them from the investment groups. We need to get them from institutional stakeholders, pension funds, and more. We can do that at lower costs if we get that 100 gigawatt at 10-year with CFDs, indexation auctions. We can raise the capital, and because of the good, stable pipeline of projects, we can also further optimize the supply chain, the design processes, the logistics, and moving from project to project, moving to a portfolio of projects, lowering the costs. So we can promise cost reductions with the industry. They say with that 100 gigawatt, we can promise cost reductions of up to 30%. Yeah. What we also promise is all the value that comes from wind energy development in Europe. It is the local energy, it's the energy security that comes with it, it's the jobs, it's the economic activity, it's the taxes that we will pay here. And that robustness is a promise that we can deliver here if we get that new offshore wind deal done. And that's the value that we can bring. And that's more than just the costs.
What has been the feedback once when you put forward this plan? Have you heard back from different governments across the continent? Have you been discussing it?
So what we have seen is that the ambitions of the governments stay very high. So there is still clear confidence that offshore wind can deliver. We've also seen, and governments have learned it the hard way, that if they get the auction design wrong, the industry is just saying, no, this doesn't work for us. We've seen it in Lithuania. We've seen it in Estonia. We've seen it with 3 gigawatts in Denmark. No bidders, failed auction. Completely wrong design. We have said that, and of course my colleague here will give some points on that. But lessons are being learned. The new auction in Denmark will be far, far better, and industry is responding to that. The same will happen in Lithuania. We've seen Estonia. So we see that governments are understanding that the desire to get just lower and lower and lower and not looking at the value is no longer the right approach. And we see that in two ways. In one way, the changes in the auction design. Apart from the ones that I mentioned, we see that governments are also moving or intend to move away from these zero subsidy bids, where you're paying the right to develop projects. Germany, the Netherlands, governments are thinking of moving away from that and going back to the CFD, like we mentioned. So that's a clear sign that it's taking up. And the second is that, of course, at the political level, as I briefly mentioned earlier, we have now in Europe the Net Zero Industry Act. And the Net Zero Industry Act makes that all renewable energy auctions, or at least 30% of all the renewable energy auctions, need to have non-price criteria attached to them. And those non-price criteria are those that capture the value that we are currently not capturing in a purely cost model. That means, on the one hand, for instance, elements like cybersecurity, responsible business conduct, those will be pre-qualification criteria. So if you want to play on the European market, the turbines have to be at the highest level of cybersecurity. Yeah. Data has to reside, for instance, in Europe, not open to states, own actors from other countries. And it needs to be done with the highest level of responsible business conduct. On top of that, it's about resilience, making sure that it doesn't all come from one single source. And then it's about additional values, where governments can choose what they need, whether it's more on the system integration side, whether it's on environmental protection, and that's positive impacts, where it's about skills and training. Those then are optional choices. But you have to include a value-based model. And that is what we see. And so the response to that is very good. And we look forward to the next sets of auctions that will come around here. And we know that some governments are already implementing some of these non-price criteria. So, for instance, France has already in their auctions several non-price criteria, and those are working very well.
Well, you just mentioned Denmark. Just so happens that we've got you with us, Rasmus, Nicolas from RINGGAARD. You are head of European cooperation at the Danish Energy Agency. Good morning.
Good morning, and Bruxelles.
So in your country, a 3 gigawatt offshore wind energy tender with uncapped negative bidding didn't attract any bids last year. There's a new 3 gigawatt tender in the works for this autumn. In the meantime, you've been on the inside of all this. You've been literally the fly on the wall. Can you tell us what the thinking was, what was said behind the doors, behind closed doors?
Thank you very much. And
can you hold the microphone?
Yeah. And yeah, definitely something did happen back in December. We learned it the hard way, so to say. It goes up and down in business, and definitely kind of went down this time around. That being said, the costs went up, and I think that's also what we basically found out during the meantime. But yeah, we had the tender zero bids, basically. We immediately started analysis on looking into what basically went wrong here. A big part of this was to have some thorough market dialogue. We had meetings with the 17 different market actors, and I think in addition to that we had 9 or 10 written inputs to our analysis, basically. And they mentioned different things. There was not like one decisive factor on what went wrong, basically, but to kind of summarize it in 3 parts. Obviously, what we just heard, costs has risen, all kind of cost, inflation, capex, opex, whatnot, and this obviously makes it into a bad business case, despite the fact that the sites were really good. It was a good seabed, it was like very good wind conditions. But those costs are risen, making it into a bad business case. Secondly, these parks were attached to one of the price zones in Denmark called the DK1, so it's the western part of Denmark. And basically you had kind of a low expectation of return in that area. Mostly because prices are quite low in that area, but also because we have still big plans to outbuild our hydrogen network, and that was delayed, basically. So the demand was lower than expected. And maybe thirdly, we don't have that much big industry in Denmark, so you couldn't really cover your risk by PPAs in that specific area. So these were kind of the things on the cost side, on the demand side. And then thirdly, in terms of timing and timelines, we all know that a lot of wind parks are going to be built up to 2030, so we were in that race, basically. Competition was tough, but also bidders, developers asked us to have longer time to basically to build the parks. So these were like kind of the 3 headlines for why it went wrong, so to say, I would say.
And so what's the plan looking forward? How is what's the new tender going to be like?
It's going to be better. hopefully also with better results. And as you just referred to, we are making severe changes to the tender design. Well, first of all, in Denmark, we are really good at sitting down, having coffee, talking together. That's kind of part of the DNA, I would say. And we are also much of the time good listeners. So we basically listened to the market. We listened to you guys. We listen to the different actors. So we're introducing, firstly, and maybe most importantly, double-sided CFD, capacity-based double-sided CFD for the upcoming tenders. So that's the one in the fall, and that's the other one in next spring. Then secondly, we are relieving some of the costs from the developers. So we are taking upon us, the government is going to pay some of the, site investigation costs that are relatively high in Denmark. We are going to pay them going forward for these tenders. And then also there are some costs associated with basically surveillance, some military infrastructure that we are going to pay as well. And thirdly, we are looking into this prospect about the timeline. So the timing and the timeline, we are delaying the deadline for when to put online the parks, so that we are kind of going behind this bump in 2030. So we are hoping to get the parks online between 32 and 34, basically. And then we are giving bidders longer time to make their bids, but also longer times to develop the parks.
Given that Denmark is one of the countries that has a lot of energy, renewable energy capacity already. The country is at times covering its whole electricity needs, all its electricity needs with it. To what extent is cooperation with other countries important? What's in the pipeline there?
Well, I think it's very important to cooperate closely together with our countries, in particular in Europe, and particular in these days with everything that is basically going on. And I would say you can see cooperation in kind of two ways. First of all, the cooperation that is being done in terms of being interconnected, as you refer to, is very important for Denmark, because we are a relatively small country. At the same time, we are geographically located quite well south of Norway, north of the rest of Europe, basically. So we are in constant dialogues with our neighbors. We are very interconnected, and we try to be even more interconnected going forward. There's now a new government in Germany. My minister actually yesterday had a good meeting with the German energy minister, and they are really looking into how to collaborate on this hydrogen projects that we have in Jutland, to try to increase, which would be good for offshore developers, increase the demand for offshore wind in the North Sea, but also looking into how we can collaborate closer in the Baltic Sea. Because basically we have a lot of wind, and we can't use it all. So we want to make it to the benefit of the rest of Europe. We of course need to find the right mechanisms for doing so. But also, I mean, in addition to the kind of interconnectivity, cooperation is super important in terms of just good old basic government-to-government collaborations. That's basically what me and my team is doing. I'm heading the European part of that, but all in all, the Danish Energy Agency has energy cooperation with 25 countries around the world. Again, Denmark is relatively small. I think we stand for around 0.1 of the global emissions. Basically, what we are doing doesn't really matter that much in terms of the climate change. So what we really want to do is to export our solutions and try to, in that way, accelerate the green transition. So it's about classic government-to-government cooperation. In Europe, we have really good cooperations with a handful of countries, including, of course, La France, and we're very happy about that. And we see already good examples of how we can basically, on the one hand, learn a lot from each other by sharing ideas, but also some of the things that we are good at, hopefully also tenders going forward, we can potentially try to teach other countries. This year, just to to mention a few examples this year, in Korea, they're adopting the Danish approach to a one-stop shop. Before, they had 17 authorities being involved in how to do offshore tenders. So we are in very close cooperation on how to evolve that. And also this year, Latvia, a country that we work closely together with, has basically established a Danish energy agency on the model of the Danish way on how to engage with the energy sector. So yeah, all over, it's super important to have close cooperation.
Given that export of electricity is important for you, are there any new interconnectors planned, or what's the latest on that?
I don't think we have anything public on the interconnectors at the moment. I'm looking at my experts in the crowd. But we are, I think the more important one would be to mention that we're looking into a closer cooperation with Germany in the Baltic Sea. And then also trying to, at the moment we are building a hydrogen pipeline in Jutland. And we would like to kind of connect that to Germany at some point in time in the future to offload some of the hydrogen to the big German industry.
Okay. Your government initially had the ambition to reach 7.7 gigawatt of installed offshore wind by 2030, 35 gigawatt by 2050. Is that still the plan?
So we are delayed on the short term, obviously due to this unfortunate tender. So just to be very honest about that, we will reach the 7 gigawatt around when these new parks come into play, so around 32 or 34, depending on the timeline here. So on the short run, we are delayed, but definitely I think the 35 you're mentioning, you're referring to the Esbjerg and the Ostende declaration. So this is the part of the North Sea collaboration, and this is still a political goal. So we are aiming hard for that. So we need all your advice and all your collaboration to get to that. I mean, is it possible? I really hope so. On the climate targets, we are reaching our goals. I mean, when we set a goal of 70% reduction some years ago, already in 2030, nobody really believed in it, and we are on the way there. We will reach that climate target. We also hopefully will reach the climate target of climate neutrality in 45. So, I mean, these things might look a bit difficult, but
okay.
Let's hope.
We're crossing fingers. So the auction design is going to be restructured. That might be good news for you, Joyce von Marschall. You are offshore development, Belgium, France, Netherlands, and global development optimization director at RWE. Good morning.
Good morning. I can't start without citing one of your colleagues who said, "Make Germany great again with Danish electricity." So obviously you're also a strong defender of that one. Yeah.
Thank you. Your company is one of the world's leading developers with 19 completed projects, 4 offshore wind farms with a total capacity of 4 gigawatt under construction. And I was going to ask you to start with, given that you're active in a lot of different countries, what's your take on the different methods, tender methods? What's your favorite one?
Okay, now a few people are looking at me. I started in RWE 4 years ago, and I started developments in 7 different countries, so I have seen quite a variety of different methods. I think Alexander and also Rasmus, you also did a very good introduction here, because obviously we see a very strong need for two-sided CFDs in the current system. Before I was in my current role, I was also working in the German sector, and some of you might also have seen the latest results, again of yesterday, where we see in a merchant environment negative bidding component. So also when we reflect on our pipeline, and we have quite a huge pipeline, we see the ups and downs of the different systems. So we have a large pipeline, obviously in the UK. We currently build offshore wind farms in Netherlands, in Denmark, and also in other parts of the world we're active. But certainly what we see with two-sided CFDs, as we see it in France or in Belgium, are certainly a preference. To be fairly honest, I also see right now an interesting movement in the Netherlands, because So we also had there a merchant environment, and the merchant environment attracts less and less bidders. And if you compare that, for example, with a project we won, which is called Oranje Wind now, and is now also under construction, back then there were way more bidders on that project. And now last year it was only 3 bidders. We have also seen in Denmark no bidders. Yesterday, 2 bidders. So the environment is really changing, and you see if you go for two-sided CFDs, usually the landscape is different. However, I would still say even a two-sided CFD can sometimes not be sufficient. So it's also about the details, because if you set the cap too low, if you don't have an indexation clause, if you have too many aspects in the market design, which is rising costs also above the cap, that really comes with downsides. So it is not a silver bullet just to put a two-sided CFD on it and also to say it's an indexation. You really need to look into the overall environment and also in the incentives to make these investments. And I think you already said it, Alexander. We see positive trends again after this huge build-out scenarios where it's the more the better, the more gigawatt, but it was less about the costs. And now we're coming back to a different setup where we also reflect upon market reality and what do we currently need. And here, I think it's clear, and that's also about the New Deal, to say we need solid investments. We need continuous investments, also for the supply chain, because supply chain costs can only come down if we have these investments. And it's the same for us. We would only do an investment if we see proper returns on that one. So that's really, really important that we have robust systems, and you also said it. That also goes hand in hand with grid connections. So in systems where you are reliant on the TSOs, if there are delays, that has a significant impact on the business case once again. And so the question is, how do you price that in? If you have delays, it comes also with a downside, because you do your business case on certain assumptions. And that's also what needs to be considered when you set a market design up. So, and I think what we also heard, we see right now projects which are not realized or auctions which fail. Then we really need to ask ourselves, why is that? And here I also see in different markets different openness to discuss this. And I think also WindEurope is really doing a great job here, and also you did a great job sitting down, drinking coffee, talking to 17 different players, because it has different truths to it, and we also need to be more open compared to how we did it before. And just taking, again, the Netherlands as an example, we have seen less attraction to an auction, but then also a very high openness to say, are we really on the right track, and what do we actually need? And I think also as a developer, we're right now also in the duty to make that visible. What does it actually mean? Where are the costs? Where are the increases? And how can we reduce them? And I think we will also hear something about the financing later. We also need to have attractive cases for our investors. But not only us, but also the TSOs, the suppliers. So how do we make that happen, that we have a solid, robust build-out in Europe and hopefully also globally at a certain point in time?
Well, you as a developer, you obviously are very close to, you have to source components. After the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the big question was, are components getting a lot more expensive? Also with COVID, obviously, is raw material going to get a lot more expensive? What's your take on that, especially over the past year or two?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not seeing in all different components that the costs go down. In some of the parts we see a slight relaxation. However, what I, for example, also hear from some of our suppliers, they are also concerned right now if projects are not realized and they see a drop of projects, because then they're not going to invest. And again, if there are no investments made, we stick to the situation where our supply chain is too expensive. And especially when we look on the last years, we see cost increases 30, 40%, even sometimes 100%. And if you then look on what you also said, power price expectations, yeah, does that match? It does not. So what you said, Alexander, is also super important, that we all bring the costs down together. But how do we do it? Also through investments, smart market design, because also if we are in a merchant environment, the financing for these projects are way more expensive compared to a two-sided CFD. So it's altogether, it is a common effort, but we still see it is very expensive. And I would also say in the next 1 or 2 years, that will be a very tough time for our sector. Yeah? Also what you compare to onshore wind. So I think it's really, really important that also the different states are open to discuss how to mitigate that, because it must be a long-term solution, like Denmark with this extraordinary experience of offshore wind. It would be such a waste of time, efforts, and workforce if you do not utilize it also in the further course. So I think also the states must be clear that they want to invest. And how do we do that? Also by further investments, obviously.
Do you think that, given that, as you just said, costs are rising and it's difficult to wiggle through, does Europe still have its seat at the table, or is the solution to bring in, for example, Chinese turbines?
Yeah, I would absolutely say it is the case. Also what you said. So when we are also asked in APEC, or also one of the reasons why we went to the US was because we have an extraordinary experience. But we should not lose track of it. So, and on the other hand, I think it is also very important, I just listened in the previous session, that we also see the energy transition also for the purpose of energy security, because all the conflicts in the world, all the crises, really protect ourselves, protect a country, protect Europe. So that's why I absolutely believe Europe needs to have a seat at the table for the experience and also for everything that means for our different industries.
And can I just talk very quickly with you about the US? To what extent the re-election of Donald Trump and his plans to limit global trade plays into this at all?
Yeah, I think the US example shows how heavy regulated or how heavy impacted offshore wind is by political changes, and also why it's so important that states stick to the plan. Because I think also we have seen that various players were facing, obviously the situation that federal permits will not be granted, and without a federal permit you cannot build a project, right? And these are huge investments, and especially every investment which is lost is bad again for the whole industry. And so that's really a strong argument also for reliable political systems to stick to the plan and to make these investments.
Thank you very much, Joyce von Marschall from RWE. Pierre WARLOP, talking about geopolitical challenges. You are Managing Director France at business consultancy Natural Power. Good morning.
Good morning.
So the EU, as we just heard, as we said earlier as well, is trying to protect its industry also through the NZIA, the Net Zero Industries Act. One requirement in that package is that 30% of the criteria for upcoming tenders have to be non-price criteria in the future. What's your take on that? Is that the right way to go about things?
It's a right way, but as long as there is an uniform interpretation on how it's supposed to be implemented. And I guess that's very much the concern as an industry, to make sure that every countries and states somehow interpret this in a consistent manner. And this, all in all, together with the regulation, as we mentioned earlier in the US, there have been some bias due to the fact that there is no inflation, no indexation formula in the PPAs, and at the same time you have non-monetary factors into the project. It needs to be thought through the overall picture. So in that respect, it could be very beneficial from energy, industrial sovereignty, but also economical and social benefits. But again, if you tweak the rules in a way that you basically force the industry in a given direction, but we cannot fulfill the expectation to deliver innovation once being affordable and addressing sustainability all at once, we may actually fall short. So that's why it needs to be, again, approached in a very comprehensive and holistic manner. It has been actually designed as such in the NSAEA, but there is still space for interpretation and implementation by states. This could lead to kind of fragmentation of the approach and how you think of your bids and design. So that's actually positive, but again, we need to be mindful about the potential pitfall. If there is non-monetary factor, there is potentially quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative might lead to lack of transparency, might lead to other complication, potential legal challenge. It needs to be solid, transparent, readable from the people as well, not as an industry, but people looking at our industry as a whole needs to see the benefits clearly and how we can collectively deliver these.
Do you think there is some kind of process underway between different governments to see what works well, what doesn't work well? For example, France could be an inspiration for some countries like Denmark?
Yes, I think they tried as much as they can to harmonize and inform their approach, but there needs to be also addressed to the specific market condition. Whether you are strong in some areas, we want to defend certain policies against EU directive as a whole. That's something basically need to be reflected, and that's actually a decent wish. But for sure, there are some different approaches with regard to system integration, to ecological design, sustainability, circularity. Sometimes these are basically easier to replicate, but if you don't consider the technology, it could lead to actually difficult conditions. If you pair basically circularity with early technology development, such as, if we can say, early floating, for instance, is a bit less advanced than bottom fix. It's a fair statement, and it can be actually a challenge to implement stringent conditions as regard to circularity, because as of now, we have not demonstrated the full commercial potential and industrial potential of some of the technologies. So this needs to be, again, thought all together with the industry, stakeholders, experts, but also as much as possible funded in a common way as an industry, European level, and also at the European institution.
Well, one thing that's quite remarkable in France is that the country has put in place this method to make sure people accept projects. There are public discussion rounds, and people can express their opinion. Can I just ask you, Rasmus, is that something that Denmark is also looking at, or is the situation completely different and everybody just loves wind energy in your country? You don't need that.
We haven't looked at that specifically, but I mean, we are meeting, since I'm here, my team is here, we're meeting all the French stakeholders tomorrow. So I could put it on the agenda and something to talk about, but I can't disclose any further information at the moment on the Danish kind of approach to this. Sorry.
All right, okay. We're talking about rising costs, and obviously it's good if governments understand that developers, but also suppliers need a certain amount of money to construct these projects. But do you think, Pierre, that this could also backfire? The more subsidies there are, the more people will be worried about how this money is being spent.
again, I think it's a matter of having a clear, transparent framework where we also measure and basically disseminate the outcomes of all these commitments, and being again in mind what needs to be considered as a pre-qualification and needs to be awarded, quantified, measured at the due course, so that basically everyone is understanding what we are trying to achieve, and not having, let's say, short-term thinking sometimes that could affect ultimately the project feasibility beyond the tender rules itself. Looking at the planning, for instance, if you're taking the wrong approach to the planning, then it just can lead the project to be non-viable or very difficult to construct in relation to the tender design and criterion. So that's obviously something for me which is defendable, but again, as long as we can have clear, measurable and recognized contribution and benefits that everyone, including the ones which are not expert in offshore wind, can actually easily grasp.
We've been talking about the NZIA since the start of this conference. There's this other rule in there that's included, that 40% of the manufacturing capacity for the projects that will be constructed here in Europe has to be located in Europe. What's your take on that, Pierre? Does that make sense?
I would say we just need to deliver what is ready on the pipe, probably. But it's a very decent, and I think it's something we need to aspire as an industry. We really need to consolidate, strengthen our capacity, innovation as well. So in that respect, that's a very good objective. That being said, if we look at the capacity as of today, just considering 75–80% of utilization ratio of all manufacturing facilities in Europe, we probably in position to deliver 7 to 8 giga a year. Considering the EU targets that you all know, which are further 130 giga ahead, if we want to reach the target by 2030, this is not stacking together. We have already a scarcity of the capacity in the supply chain just to try to deliver the target. The question is whether we need to be ruled by the target per se. I'm not sure. Today, we just make sure that there is projects viable, which can actually overcome the complex macroeconomic situation right now. And we need to give confidence so that the investor basically are keen to further invest and expand their capacity and make sure that basically all comes together. But today, indeed, if you would have to basically catch up with the target, we won't be able as of today. That's where we need to bring back the confidence. We need to bring back a balance criteria in tenders, and we need to make sure that we are gently catching up with the capacity requirements, but also looking at the new technology and how the suppliers actually endorse these new technologies and make sure that they can be built out of European factories.
Alexander, you seem to disagree.
Yeah, I just want to...
Can you just hold it very close to you?
Yeah, I will do it. I think there's two things here. I think one is that target of 36 gigawatt of wind manufacturing capacity. That's both on and offshore, right? So it's not just offshore. And indeed, we've been looking very hard at WindEurope with all of our members, some here, of course, on the table, of, okay, what does that mean? Can we reach that target? And where do we stand? And what we've seen is that for onshore wind, we have capacity, manufacturing capacity of around 30 gigawatt a year, which is far more than we are installing. If we look at the offshore sector, you mentioned that 7, 8, maybe with the latest investment, it goes up to roughly 10 gigawatts for almost all of the components. We installed 2.6 gigawatts of offshore wind last year. Yeah. So And we know that we're investing even more in upgrades of facilities. We had, for instance, here, one of your sponsors of the event in Le Havre, Siemens Gamesa, investing more. We've had foundations investments. So the supply chain is really ramping up to reach that target. Meanwhile, we remain a net exporter of equipment. The European wind industry is a clean tech exporter for Europe. I don't think there are many other clean tech sectors in Europe that can say the same. So can we deliver on the targets? I think yes. But what we need is to make sure that those factories are running at 100%, and that the investments fully mature so that, as Joyce said, with that planning, we can lower down the costs. But we can make it happen for wind in Europe.
Well, that's one of the problems, right? Here in France, for example, there is an issue with the years to come. There's some kind of gap in the construction schedule. So how are you going to deal with that?
So there are needs. So where do we see the bottlenecks? One is in ports, port capacity. If we want to develop offshore wind and go to those levels of 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 gigawatts a year, we need investments in ports. There are a lot of ports that are planning to make investments, but they are held back by two things. One, the pipeline of projects is not yet there. Right now, they may have to make choices. Do I go for a cargo terminal for this new quayside, or do I go for offshore wind, or do I use it for something else? What is the most likely stable source of revenue? Right now, due to the governments, to the lack of available pipeline of auctions and capacity, it's not yet for ports possible to say we go full for offshore wind. Some ports have done it and succeeded. Some ports have done it and are facing challenges. The second bottleneck that we see is grids. We can build those wind farms, but if the grid capacity doesn't follow, then those wind farms are idle. And I mentioned in the opening statement the Borkum Riffgrund 3 wind farm in Germany. It's fully installed. Everything is there. It has no grid connection. The wind farm is idle for more than a year. Grid connection will come in 2026. That's a huge risk. So we need more capacity on the grid side, the connections. We also need the technology and more capacity to ensure that we can deliver the electricity and avoid grid congestion. Curtailment rates went up last year across Europe. In Germany, in France, that's wasted energy. That's wasted clean electricity that doesn't reach the businesses in Europe that desperately need it because we want to decarbonize. And we have more incentives to have decarbonized goods and services here in Europe. The best way to do it is using clean electricity. If we don't get it there, then we don't achieve those targets. So on ports, infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, and grid infrastructure, those are the key bottlenecks at the moment.
Now, this is the current situation right now. Pierre, you've been around for a while, obviously in the French market since 2007. Would you say with the current cost structure and the revenue structure, how has it developed over the years? Is it easier now to construct offshore wind farms, more difficult? What's your take?
I will avoid to paraphrase what has been done and told earlier, but obviously there has been a shift in the revenue and route to market, as in the sense that there are much more merchant projects today than it has been in the past. If we trust what is ongoing right now, there probably around more than 35% of the project will be merchant by the next 5 years. These are obviously somehow subject to the volatility of electricity and electrification as a whole. So we'll have a play on whether we can actually have profitable projects and how this will further develop. So there are different DNA in that respect. There are companies which are acting as a retailing, others are pure player IPPs. So you can predict, let's say, one way of dealing with those entities because they all have their own approach, their own market priority. and they are, as you can see, they're picking up some of the market, and some are actually avoided because they don't see the condition gathered, so they can actually develop and build the projects. So in a sense, there is all the discussion we have right now is how to make sure that the stagnation we observe right now is actually removed, and all the boulders are removed, so that we can reassess the situation of some of the tenders. Tenders are being developed over the years, sometimes not necessarily catching up with the fast evolving landscape. And tender design somehow not always reflect the situation and how it evolved the last few years. So that's really the matter of how we can make sure these projects are built. And obviously, this is different play, different approach than the one we had years ago, because obviously we have probably more competition on the supply landscape in terms of wind turbine. Today there is a different approach across the nameplate capacity. Some are pursuing further industrialization of existing platform 15 megawatt. Others are basically continuously investing in new innovative products and 20 plus. So basically, as a developer, you approach the risk, and whether the tender design allow you to have a more or less risky approach as regards to the developing project and product and portfolios. So this basically comes with some kind of consolidation in all meanings on the private end with the developers, but also, as we say, as regards to the tender design and how we put the regulation in place so that everyone is getting back on track and at some point further grow, becoming, let's say, an adult after being in nice early years where we had all good condition and cost of capital which was more affordable than today, because everything is connected, obviously.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. Let's have a look at the reasons of cost increases with you, Bertrand, JACQUET. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to look at you. You're the director, thank you. You're the director of UK-based consultancy Green Giraffe, and you told me before this conference that there are two specific reasons that you'd like to underline for which costs have gone up since 2022, 2023.
Yes, good morning. So yes, there are. So the two main reasons that are explaining the increase in cost for offshore wind, as we all know, is obviously capex. So there has been a quite significant increase in.
Can you hold the microphone really close?
Quite significant increase in construction cost over the past few years. But another main key driver of the increase of the LCOE of offshore wind is cost of capital. And sometimes we think it's okay, just another one, a minor one, but actually cost of capital has quite a big impact on the LCOE of offshore wind projects. So if you look at renewable projects, they don't have a variable fuel cost, right? If wind is free, solar irradiation is free. So the ultimate cost of electricity of renewable project is quite impacted by the cost of capital. And so if we look at numbers, maybe a couple of years back, in around 2021, we were around 50 euro per megawatt hour of LCOE for offshore wind in Europe. And if you assume an increase of 40% of construction costs, that increase your LCOE by 15 euros. If you increase your OPEX by 20%, that increase your LCOEs by an additional 5 euros, so 20 euros altogether for CAPEX and OPEX. And then if you look at the increase in cost of capital, which has been plus 3% plus 3% over the past few years, that's an additional 20 to 25 euro per megawatt hour. So that's more than CAPEX and OPEX impact on the LCOE. So that's quite substantial. Mm-hmm. So before the increase in rates, which started to happen around 2021, 2022, after the COVID crisis, we were in an environment where cost of capital, as you were saying, Pierre, was very cheap. So the risk-free rate component of the cost of capital, which is basically the rates which are set by the ECB and by the Fed, were roughly at zero, and they were at zero for quite a long time since the past financial crisis in 2010, 2011. So we were in this period for 10 years with interest rate or risk-free rate at 0%, and so a cost of capital which was very low. And because it lasted for 10 years, everybody thought, oh, okay, that's the new normal, right? But that was probably not the normal situation at all, right? It was just the consequences of the financial crisis that we had at the end of the 2010 years. And so now we are back to an environment which is more in line with what we had in the past for the long term. So we have seen the interest rate go up significantly. We hope and we think it's going to go down in the future, but it will most likely not go down to the level where we were at a few years back, and that we all thought it was a new normal when it was not a new normal. So that's the first thing, the cost of capital has increased. And as a result of that, there is also a scarcity of capital. There is less capital than before. It's not just more expensive, but there is less of it. And the reason why there is less of it is because the provider, the ultimate provider of capital, they have become more conservative and more demanding on the investment that they make. They want to make sure, because the cost of capital is higher, that they get return which are matching this higher cost of capital. So if you look, for instance, at infrastructure fund, they are a big player in the renewable sector and including in the offshore wind sector. So they have been struggling over the past few years to raise capital from institutional investors, when 5 years back it was much easier for them to raise capital. And if I make a small joke, let's say, today if you want to be able to raise capital easily, you need to be either building data center or selling AI chips, but for all the other sectors it's much harder, and investors are much more demanding. So that's the quite significant impact on the LCOE of the project, and the ability also of the project developer to fund themselves to develop the projects.
And would you agree with the point of view that rising costs are not necessarily bad news for the industry?
Yeah, so I think on the first question, I was really focusing on cost of capital, and this is basically driven by the macroeconomic environment, and there is not much we can do about that. So that's a world we need to live in and accept it. But then there is the other component, main component of the increase, which is capex. And so we could argue that the increase in capex is detrimental for the sector because it increases the LCOE. But it was probably not actually completely detrimental, because if you look at the situation we were at a few years back, there was definitely a race to the bottom in all the main offshore wind markets, especially triggered by the auction system that were put in place. So the auction system are good because they make sure that you get the most competitive source of electricity. So the most competitive player will be that their most competitive price, and you have the best price for the economy and for the society. But because the competition was so stiff for the project, the prices probably went too low, and there was also a lot of pressure on all the value chain in the offshore wind sector. So, and more importantly, on the turbine manufacturer side. So if you look at the margin that the turbine manufacturer were making a few years back, it was just not sustainable in the long term, right? And the reason why the margin was so low is because the project were bidding very low and were then putting pressure on the supply chain. So the fact that there has been an increase on the capex side is a good news in the sense that it's making the supply chain sustainable in the long term. And so we've seen an increase in capex over the past few years, and so effectively an increase, for instance, in turbine prices. And then this increase in cost is there is less upward pressure, let's say, but we are not seeing the price of the turbine go down as much as the costs are not going up, which means that margins are improving, and which is good for the turbine manufacturer.
We were talking about turbines earlier on. Do you think, well, one way to bring down costs would be to bring in Chinese turbines, cheaper Chinese turbines? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so that's an interesting discussion. Obviously, a Chinese topic has been an important topic for all in Europe for a while now. So what we are seeing at Giraffe is that so if you look on paper, that makes sense. If you look just at numbers and you want to be the most competitive, you should go for a Chinese turbine, right? Because it's cheaper. So if it's built in China, it's going to be probably 30% cheaper than in Europe, like a European competitor. And if it's a Chinese turbine built in a plant in Europe, it's probably going to be 15% cheaper than a European turbine built in Europe. So if you look on paper, you say, okay, if I want to be the most competitive, I will go for a Chinese turbine. That's a no-brainer, right? But it's not that easy. So first of all, you need to be able to finance these turbines, right? And there is still reluctance or wariness from the financier, and especially on the lender side, to finance Chinese turbine, because this has not been done in Europe before, and also because you want to make sure that this turbine and the turbine contract attached to them are bankable from a financing perspective. And so what we see is that 5 years ago, no banks was going to look at a project who was using a Chinese turbine and was going to provide financing to such a project. And now we see banks more and more keen to entertain this possibility. So we would say 50% of the bank are potentially ready now to look at a project which would be using a Chinese turbine. It's not going to be a walk in the park, but it's something that they could consider. And then there are probably 50% of the remainder of the banks who won't look at it for now, but who might be looking at it when they will have been already first financing with Chinese turbine made by the other banks which are open to looking at it today. So that's one thing. It's becoming more and more possible. When 5 years ago everybody would have told you no banks will ever finance turbine projects in Europe with Chinese turbine. So that's really on the financing side. But then there are other considerations, so that were mentioned before, on all the regulation in Europe which is being put in place to protect the European industry. So we have in Europe we have been leaders of offshore wind, and we have a leading manufacturer of turbines, and we want to make sure that we preserve that, right? Because that's a key industrial asset for Europe. So that's something we need to protect, and that's why there is those regulations which are put in place, and that's also obviously having an impact on the project, right? So you need to comply with this regulation, so you don't have all the freedom that you would want to choose a Chinese turbine, for instance. So that's kind of let's say, the driving forces for whether to use Chinese turbine or not. And then what we also see in practice, there are different type of situation for the project developer which may push them to look at the Chinese turbine alternative. So if you look at the fixed bottom offshore wind project, so as I said before, we were a few years back in an environment that was completely different, so prices were much lower, so some projects secured CFDs at a very low level, which is not necessarily competitive anymore. And so if you want to be able to still develop such project, you have almost no alternative but to go for a Chinese turbine, because otherwise your project is not going to be economic. So that's one case where project developer may want to push for or look seriously for a Chinese turbine. And another scenario where we see developer also looking quite seriously to Chinese turbine is for floating offshore wind project. So the first commercial scale for floating offshore wind project in Europe, so let's say around 100, 200 megawatt. They are commercial scale, but they are still small projects compared to the big offshore wind project, the fixed bottom offshore wind project that we have in Europe. So they are struggling to get traction with the European turbine manufacturer, because their order book, they're fully booked, and so they cannot supply turbine to this smaller project. So again, for this project, the floating offshore wind project in Europe, the first commercial scale ones, they need to go to the Chinese manufacturer to find a turbine manufacturer who can actually supply turbine to their project. So that's what we are seeing at the moment.
Joyce von Marschall, would you like to react to that as a developer? No?
I think you really gave a good summary. It's not that easy. It's not only to say on paper it looks cheaper. It is really about regulatory framework. It is about financeability. It is about the technical items. So you cannot say one size fits all. But certainly, I think question is, do we continue as we are with mainly 2 OEMs, or do we need more? But we're not completely there yet, in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyce von Marschall. Thank you, Alexander VANDENBERGHE, Rasmus, Nicolas, RINGGAARD, sorry, I'm really struggling with your name. Pierre, WARLOP, and Bertrand, JACQUET. Thank you for participating. Thank you for listening.
Right.